Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Chosen People Ministries Tuesday night Bible study. Tonight, we're going to look at the fourth chapter of Hebrews. We're working our way through the book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And this is an interesting chapter because in some ways, it's very repetitive. Which you would expect, repetitive. You'd expect it to. Well, you'd expect it. You wonder, why does it keep saying the same thing? What is the purpose of this repetition, this structure? And I think it's the importance of this idea of Sabbath rest. So in most of the Bible translations, this chapter will be called the Sabbath rest for the people of God. But I wonder, I had certainly really not reflected on the importance of that Sabbath rest beyond keeping or not keeping the Sabbath, something like that. Maybe the equivalent is going to church on a Sunday, even though and being calling it the Lord's Day and be very clear that it's not the Sabbath and that kind of thing. When we look at this, chapter, we need to see where the writer of Hebrews wants us to be, and where he wants us to be is chapter 16. He says, verse 16. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. The purpose of chapter 4 is to show us this approach, so we can approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we can receive mercy and find the grace that we need to help us in our time of need. Richard talked about the need of the Christians in Russia and the need of the Christians in the Ukraine. Hebrews is talking about the need of all Christians to receive mercy from God and find grace to help us in our time of need. I think there's a perpetual need. We're in perpetual need. Sometimes we realize it, sometimes we don't. But really, we constantly need God's mercy and his grace. And 16 says, let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence. So yesterday, as I was telling some people, some of you earlier, I was driving some Americans around London, and the first place that they wanted to go to was Buckingham Palace. You will not be surprised to discover that as we approached the palace, we couldn't simply enter into the throne room. In fact, the Queen wasn't even there. There were huge gates barring our way. But it's majestic when you drive down the Mall and you see that iconic golden sort of statue sitting in the middle of the roundabout. It's very impressive. But for us, we have something more impressive, because if those were the gates of heaven, and if that was the throne on which God stood, we would be able to walk through the gates. The soldiers would say, "Morning, Simon. Morning, Steve. Morning, Eileen. Morning, Maggie. In you come. The Queen's been waiting for you." Or in our case, the King has been waiting for you. And as I think we've been seeing, when we see that's our destination, it resets us and it helps us to persevere. Last week in Hebrews chapter 3, we read, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful and unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God." It's our job, ladies and gentlemen, to help each other to not allow our hearts to become hard and turn away from the living God. That was the purpose. That was the purpose of Hebrews 3. And now we're going to look at some detail at Hebrews 4, which flows on from there, because Hebrews 4 begins with a therefore. So we'll need to just remember that as we start. Therefore, since the promise of eternal entering into his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you are found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said. So we're told that this promise of eternal rest, that maybe the people in the wilderness thought they would enter when they crossed into the promised land, we're told that the promise still stands. The promise to enter into God's rest still stands, but there is a risk that we could fall short of it. This is a little difficult. Some of Hebrews is a little bit difficult in the sense that those of us who would hold to God choosing us before creation to be blameless in his sight, Ephesians 1 verse 4, we'd say, well, once you've been chosen, you can't fall short of the glory of God, because he who begins a good work in us will see it through to completion. So we have those promises. So perhaps I think the best way to understand this idea is not to fallen short in the sense of sin, but falling short of entering into the wonder of being able to walk with the creator of the universe as your heavenly Father, to experience Jesus as your high priest, to know that he knows you and he understands you. And we'll see again and again how Hebrews wants to teach us how great our relationship with this high priest is. Verse 2 tells us that the problem in the wilderness was not that the message was incorrect, but the message wasn't applied. Now, they didn't add faith and obedient faith to the message. And it is surprising that it says that the gospel was the same proclaimed in the desert as it is to us today. But it's God's redemptive purposes are unchanging because they are part of his character, which is unchanging. So we have something that in God's rest that will be consummated in the future, but was finished in the distant past. It's a bit like an engagement and a wedding. If you take engagement seriously, it is certain that you will marry. So this rest that Joshua and Caleb entered into because they put their faith into practice still exists for us and for others as we go forward. And that's a bit like the engagement, and the wedding is still to come. We're still waiting for this great wedding. The doors have not been closed. They remain open so that people can enter into his rest. Now in verse 3, we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said. So I declare on oath, in my anger, they will never enter my rest. This is the psalm that we saw sitting right in the center of chapter 3. But you'll see that it's quoted again, but the last verse is quoted, not the first verse. And if those of you who like to run ahead and see what's coming around the corner, if you scoot up to verse 7, you'll see that the first verse of the psalm is there. So we've got the same psalm, but just spun round. You see that? I don't think that's a coincidence that he's done that. He's done it for some sort of of purpose. He wants us, he's trying to hold lots of different ideas all together to try and give us a sort of three-dimensional picture. Because next he's going to say, and yet his work has been finished since the creation of the world. Now what he's doing is he's adding Genesis, the first 2 chapters of Genesis, he's adding that to the wilderness story. He's adding it to the wilderness story. So he says, and yet his work had been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he's spoken about the 7th day in these words. On the 7th day, God rested from all his work. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Do you see what I mean about this business, about the repetitive nature of this section of text? He's not this, when you hear this phrase, they shall never enter my rest, it should break our hearts, because the door into God's rest is open for all. And yet we see that to be chosen and to have the truth of the gospel revealed to us by the Holy Spirit is something rare and precious. Therefore, in verse 6, since it remains for some to enter that rest, since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Even Hebrews knows that it's repeating the same thing again and again. And I think it's worth looking at this psalm that is being repeated again and again, Psalm 95. And if you want to turn to it, you are more than welcome. But what we don't see in Hebrews is that Psalm 95 is a psalm of praise. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Today, if you only would hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in Meribah, as you did in that day in Massah, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I had done. For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, those people whose hearts go astray and have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. So Psalm 95 begins with a celebration song of thanksgiving. And then the second half is a prophetic word of exhortation to the community. I remember last week, I was talking about the book of Hebrews having no sense of encouraging individuals to remain outside the community. Individuals are saved in order to become part of God's family. And in Psalm 95, it's described in the way that we read, we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. So in a section where we've been talking about our hard hearts, we're listening to a quote that starts with what almost sounds like a church meeting. Come, let us sing together for the joy of the Lord. Let's come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. You can almost sense there going to church, gathering together, singing, and all coming together in joy, and then hearing the word spoken to us. And it always softens our hearts. No matter what kind of a day we've had, no matter what kind of a week we've had, gathering together once a week to do that is a great thing for every Christian, an essential thing for every Christian. And he says that God set again a certain day, calling it today. He did this long time after David, through David. So we have we've got a picture of David saying, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." Of this Sabbath rest that's being offered. And then in verse 8 we hear, if Joshua had given them rest, God would have not spoken later about a Sabbath day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest also rest from their own work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. When you look at the sweep from 6 to 11, we are adding a day to the seventh day of creation, or we're entering into the seventh day of creation. And as you look at Genesis 2, you will see it's Genesis 2 verse 1 begins by saying, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array." And then if you looked back to Genesis 1 verse 1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." That's an incluso. Those are two bookends that tell you that God created everything and then he structured everything. He created everything and he structured it. Everything was completed in its vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work that he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creation that he had done. I talked about repetition in Hebrews 4, and there's a lot of repetition in Genesis 1 and 2. And it distinguishes the seventh day from all the other days. You'll see that there's this familiar phrase, God saw that what he had made and it was good. And there was morning and evening on the ... day. That's absent in the seventh day. Instead, by the seventh day, God had saw all that he'd already seen. What he had made was very good. And he added to that this seventh day, where he would rest from all his work, all the work of creating that he'd done. The idea of the seventh day was, so God had made the universe for his people, Adam and Eve, to live with him in creation as co-regents, as his co-regents, as his co-kings, if you like, and that they would be in perfect relationship with each other, with God and their environment. The creator, the creature, and the creation, all perfectly together. And he blessed this day and made it holy. He set it aside as a picture of something wonderful. So we've got this seventh day, God having finished his work, and this encouragement to enter into this rest. So the rest that we can enter into is something, is a present experience and a future certainty. The rabbis found this whole subject fascinating because they wanted to know, they wanted to discuss whether or not the people in the wilderness would actually enter into the promised land. Would that generation that perished enter in the promised land? There's a letter called Tu Baruch, and it says, as they reflect on the temple being destroyed in 70 AD, it said, after God had brought down everything which is in the world, he sat down in eternal peace on the throne of the kingdom, and then joy will be revealed and rest will appear. The rabbis understood that this Sabbath rest was the coming of the Messiah and the coming of the Messianic age, and that the seventh day had been given as a picture of Sabbath rest. And what we're being told here is that failure to enter is not because it's unavailable. I mean, he's given us a very simple way of entering into this rest. It's a bit like the way you buy a train ticket in Barcelona. In Barcelona, you buy a little book of tickets, and then those tickets are valid for a journey. And when you get on the bus, you have to validate the ticket by sticking it into a machine that's normally on a post. And it validates the ticket, then you take it out, and then you can go on your journey. You can go into the land. So it's not enough that you know you've got the tickets that are valid. They have to be validated. And it's the same with us entering into this rest. And the rest is inextricably linked to the creation, to the pre-fall world. And so the seventh day is not limited by time and space as the other 6 days are. They're available to us now. So that because the seventh day never ended, it continues to this day and will continue to eternity. It'll continue, in fact, to the last day. And so there's a theologian called Attridge. He writes this. He says, thus the imagery of rest is best understood as a complex symbol for the whole soteriological process. For those of you that had to look up soteriological like I did, it reminds me that it means the doctrine of salvation. So it's Sabbath rest is an image of a salvation truth. And he says it's for the whole process that Hebrews never fully articulates, but which involves personal and corporate dimensions. It's the process of entering into his presence, the heavenly homeland, 11:16, an unshakable kingdom, 12:28, that begins at baptism, 10:22, and is consummated as a whole eschatologically. Ooh, this man has a lot of vocabulary for us to grasp. The Sabbath rest is a complex symbol showing us the process of entering into God's presence, the heavenly homeland, the unshakable kingdom, and it will only be consummated like a marriage on the last day. There's a day when it will be consummated. There's another theologian called Von Rad. He says, Sabbath rest is an eschatological expectation of fulfillment of the prophecies of redemption. So that the Sabbath rest is not something that we have. We can enter into it, but it won't be, it's an expectation that will be fulfilled in the last days. And lastly, A.T. Lincoln says, it's the consummation of God's purposes for creation. It's which is brilliantly short and says quite a lot. The consummation of God's purposes for creation. That's what the Sabbath rest is. It's a promise that will return to the pre-fall Eden relationship that is described so clearly in Revelation. So having said all that about the wonders of Sabbath rest as a symbol of salvation, let's look at verses 12 to 14. Verse 12, for the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing the soul and the spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and the attitudes of heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. Later on, Hebrews is going to say it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Here, we get a picture of the word of God being alive and active, first of all. In the past, in verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 1, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors, the prophets, in various ways, but in the last days, in the end times, which we're now in, he has spoken to us through his Son, who we know from John's Gospel is the Word of God made flesh, alive and active. And then this phrase, sharper than any double-edged sword. I made a double-edged sword for my son. For one, the Romans had a double-edged sword, which was the most efficient sword ever designed, perfectly weighted, swang. They could use it in close combat, out in the field. It was the thing, this double-edged sword. And so I looked to see where I would find the double-edged sword elsewhere in Scripture, and I only found it in 3 places in the New Testament. I wonder if you have a guess as to where. Well, I suppose it's easy enough to guess the first one. It's in this passage, but the other 2 passages were in Revelation. In Revelation 1:16, out of Jesus's mouth came a sharp double-edged sword. You see, it's not just a double-edged sword, but it's a sharp double-edged sword. His face shone like the sun in all its brilliance, reminding us of the transfiguration, which is also in some respects about entrance into the promised land, because we see Moses and Elijah there and know that they have finally entered into the promised land. And then secondly, in one of the letters to the churches, chapter 2, verse 12, these are the words of him who has the double-edged sword. So I'd never really seen that eschatological element to the beginning of this passage of before today. And this sword that he's holding, that we now can think of as being in this judgment, penetrates even to dividing the soul and the spirit, the joints and the marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of heart. It teaches us that salvation is not simply a matter of a community or an individual, but that God is going to judge with great penetrative precision. Nothing in creation is going to be hidden from his sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. That day is in the future. That final judgment described there, of the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. It's the day where every single person who has ever lived will be raised to face judgment and will have to give an account for their lives. It reminded me of Psalm 139, where in verse 2 our thoughts are seen by him, our actions are visible to him. He knows our words in verse 4 before we say them. And David at the end of the psalm asks that search him and see if there is anything unpleasing in him, in his heart. This is the sense of something that God is doing with us even tonight, even today, but will ultimately be fulfilled in the end times. And then we get a fourth, therefore, since we have a great high priest who's ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to feel sympathy for our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. This complicated tapestry that Fiona has been talking about as an illustration of what the book of Hebrews is like is getting very complicated. He's now sewing in this image of the high priest, which we had in chapter 2, verse 17 and 18. In 17 and 18, we met a merciful and faithful high priest who made atonement for the sins of his people. Now we've got this great high priest who has ascended into heaven. And we're told to hold firm to this faith. His priesthood is his intercession between us and God. And his ascension into heaven, well, he's heading for Daniel 7, where he's going to be enthroned with the Ancient of Days. And this is the hope that we're told to hold firmly to. And in 15, I love it that it says, we do not have a high priest who's unable to feel sympathy for our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, yet did not sin. Many times I've heard God talked about in the terms of being compassionate and how superior in some ways that is to sympathy. Tea and sympathy, I think, is the phrase, that you look on somebody else and their situation and you feel sorry for them, but in some ways compassion is more sophisticated because in some way you come alongside and understand fully not only their experience but why they're feeling it. Well, in this case, our priest, he's able to feel sympathy for us. He looks on us, and as it says in the Psalms, he remembers that we're dust. He remembers that we're like grass in Isaiah 40. He knows we're weak and feeble and frail. But he's also compassionate in the second half because he's been tempted in every way just as we were and did not sin. There's where he's different. So it's lovely. He's sympathetic, compassionate, and strong. Where we lack sympathy, compassion, and strength, he has it in abundance. And the book of Hebrews is asking us to hold on to our faith because that faith allows us to access this sympathy, compassion, and strength. And he's saying to us, let's approach God with grace and confidence so that we may receive mercy and find the grace to help us in our time of need. It's such a privilege to be invited to the palace, isn't it? You know, people always have if people are invited to the palace, you know they're going to have that picture on Facebook of them holding up the medal afterwards. It's not something that most people keep quiet. And we have been offered not just a medal, but we've been given a key to the entrance of God's throne room. and there we will always find grace to help us in our time of need. The last thing I wanted to share with you was just to invite you to think again about Jesus in the Gospels and his engaging in debate about the Sabbath. In John 5, we have the healing at the pool, where the invalid can't get healed because he always gets pushed aside, and he gets healed, and he breaks the Sabbath. In verse 10, the day on which this took place, chapter 5, verse 10, was a Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who was being healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." So on the Sabbath, what he's done is healed the man. He's restored him to a tiny fragment of the seventh day picture that we saw in Genesis. But the religious Jewish people, because everyone in the story is Jewish, they're shouting out that the law forbids you to carry the mat. It's a comedy that this great healing miracle takes place, and they're carrying the mat. The man's carrying the mat, and what the religious people see is the law being broken, not the man being saved. And he says, "Look, the man who made me well said, 'Pick up your mat and walk.' If it had happened to you and the man had told you to walk and take the mat, you would have done the same, wouldn't you?" It also clearly shows that this man was Jewish and didn't want to break the Sabbath as he'd been told by the religious people. But in the face of a greater authority, one who is described as the Lord of the Sabbath elsewhere in the Gospels, he picks it up. And the man who has no idea who he's healed him, because Jesus slips away later to find him in the temple and to tell him to stop sinning, or something worse might happen to you. And that might well be part of the encouragement of Hebrews, is to stop sinning so that something worse doesn't happen to us. And then look, verse 16. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the religious Jews persecuted him. Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work, and to this very day I too am working." Jesus is making reference to what Hebrews calls Jesus is sustaining all things by the power of his word in Hebrews 1:3. And what we saw in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, that although he's finished with his work of creation, he is not finished with his work. And his work is to offer this day of salvation to anybody who will hear the message of the gospel, respond to it in faith, and apply that faith to the way that they live. And this is always going to be a challenge to people. Do you remember quite how the religious Jewish people responded? They said, for this reason, it says that John says that for this reason, the religious Jews tried all the harder to kill Jesus, not only because he was breaking the Sabbath, but because he was calling himself God. He was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. When you see Jesus entering into the Sabbath and healing, that's the Sabbath rest that we're being offered. And it's just a different way of maybe looking at those passages and seeing something in them to encourage us to hold firm. Hebrews is going to point us, he's always going to be pointing us, the writer, to standing firm and standing together. The way to stand firm is to stand together, to encourage one another, as long as it's today, which means every day, so that these great truths, this great entrance into this Sabbath rest will be ours, and that keeping our eyes and our hearts and our minds focused on that destination is what will keep us going in in what are very difficult times for almost everybody as we look at the world and all that it's and all the confusion it's offering. So I hope that Hebrews 4 was of some help, and I will stop now.